Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here, back with something a little different. Well, it didn't used to be different, but it's been different for the last little while. Today I'm going to do a first impressions video of the DCS F4U Corsair module, which is definitely exciting. Now, I hasten to point out that these are my first impressions, not the first impressions that the community has had. I know that the module's been out for a while, and there has been a fair bit of comment on it. I haven't participated in a lot of that discussion, so I'm just going to tell you what I think about the Corsair and also about the Essex-class aircraft carrier and the World War II Marianas map. Now, if you're just here for the too long didn't read, this module's good. Very good. In fact, I think it's already one of my favorite warbirds in DCS, and the reason for that is subtle, but important. It feels like a real warbird, but it's not impossible for me to fly. That's the gist of it. I guess there are those in the community who didn't feel that it's enough of a challenge. I'm not one of those. And honestly, I do know that this is a hard balance to strike. There is strong pressure from certain elements of the commentiverse that wants developers to make these modules almost impossible to fly for average players, because those who want to make it their life's work to learn how to fly them want to tell the rest of us how we don't know what we're doing. But the truth of us is that most of us don't have that kind of time or commitment to be able to learn to fly some of the aircraft that are even out there in DCS. I certainly can tell you that. So why am I impressed with the Corsair? I think I'm impressed because it respects my time and my skill curve, but it also provides an experience that is unique and feels pretty authentic to me. So before we get into that, though, let's back up and give this aircraft its historical context, because if you're a fan of this channel, you already know that I love context, but it's also, you also know that it's never just about how an airplane flies, it's about why it exists at all. So the story of the F4U Corsair begins in 1938 when the U.S. Navy issued a request for a carrier-based fighter that could exceed 300 knots. This was a pretty big ask at the time, so Vought responded with a pretty radical design. They took the most powerful engine they could find, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. They combined it with the largest propeller they could find, and then they designed the rest of the aircraft around that problem. Well, that's where the Corsair's signature bent wings came from. To get the most out of the R2800, they really didn't need a very big prop, and that would normally have meant very long landing gear, but long struts and carrier landings don't mix all that well. So the inverted gull wing let them keep the gear short while still clearing the prop. By the way, quick sidebar on the designation, the F4U might sound like it's somehow related to the F4 Phantom II, but it's not. That's because in World War II, the Navy was still using its own nomenclature for aircraft, and in that system, F stood for fighter. 4 meant it was the fourth fighter design accepted by the Navy from that manufacturer, and that manufacturer was Vought, whose manufacturer code was U, and that's how we got F4U. The current system of naming aircraft with sequential numbers was not adopted by the Navy until 1962 and the Great Renaming, when Robert McNamara got tired of hearing the U.S. Navy and Air Force refer to the same aircraft by different names. Okay, the digression ends. Despite all of the effort of the Vought designers, when the Corsair first entered service, it was a handful. In particular, it was a challenge to land on a carrier. The nose was long, the gear was stiff, and it bounced. So, initially, the Navy stayed away from basing it on carriers, and it went to land-based Marine squadrons in the Pacific during the Second World War, starting in late 1942. But it also went to the Royal Navy, because, frankly, it was available. Now, the Royal Navy operated from carriers, and they operated from even smaller decks than the Americans, which added a bit of spiciness to learning to fly the Corsair, I think, for Royal Navy pilots. But they eventually figured out how to tame it for sea operations. And the key, I think, was partly to shorten the final approach so that the pattern became more of a corkscrew and less of a racetrack, and the pilots spent less time looking over the nose of the aircraft and more time looking at the deck. Regardless of how, the Royal Navy did show it was possible to operate the Corsair, even in point of fact, I think you can still see the legacy of the approach they use today, in that the time aircraft spend, in final in the groove is actually quite short compared to the way a normal land-based racetrack landing pattern would work. So I think the Royal Navy came up with some real innovations that worked. And eventually the U.S. Navy brought the Corsair back to the fleet. Now, the other principal Navy fighter at the time was the F-6F Hellcat. It and the Corsair became the dominant force in the air war in the Pacific. The combination of high performance of these aircraft, combined with the very well-trained pilots that the Navy was bringing on, meant that by 1943 the U.S. Navy was dominating the air over the water. In fact, the United States Navy was so dominant that there was increasingly less and less need for an air superiority fighter at all. There was also less and less call for the anti-shipping role because, frankly, the Japanese Navy didn't really have any ships left, and the ones they did have, they didn't have the fuel to power. So increasingly, naval air power was being used to support operations on land by, say, the second half of 1944. Now, both the Hellcat and the Corsair began increasingly to be used in an air-to-ground role. In fact, as the war went on, the Navy began to increasingly phase both torpedo and dive bombers out of their deck loads, preferring instead to carry more fighter bombers that could perform in multiple roles. And the Corsair proved to be nearly ideally suited for this role, because the Corsair was fast, even at low altitude. But it was also rugged, and even without ordnance, it hit pretty hard with 650 cal machine guns. But where it really stood out was its ability to carry bombs and rockets, and eventually napalm. While its usable payload was about the same as the Hellcat's at 4,000 pounds, its wing design did actually allow for it to carry a better configuration of hardpoints, which allowed it to carry different combinations of larger bombs and also more rockets than the Hellcat. And as the Pacific Air War shifted from dogfighting to ground attack, the Corsair pretty much shifted with it. By 1944, it was being used as a strike aircraft just as often as a fighter, supporting Marines in places like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In fact, it became the Marine fighter aircraft of choice specifically because it was good at supporting troops on the ground. But the Corsair story did not end in 1945. Whether it was the prescience by Vought or not, I don't know. But while Grumman continued to develop their fighter designs to be better dogfighters, focusing on speed and climb rate in the F-7F and the F-8F, Vought doubled down on the ground attack capacity of the Corsair, coming out with the AU-1 version that added armor to protect the pilot and oil coolers that were moved to make them less vulnerable to ground fire. So while Grumman fighters were largely replaced by 1950 by the first generation of jet fighter, the Corsair kept going strong in light of its light attack role, in which it was usually paired up with the A-1 Sky Raider that populated the heavy attack squadron. And so the Corsair was back in the thick of it in Korea, still flying from Essex-class carriers, still carrying bombs, rockets, and napalm. Yeah, it was slower than the jets, but unlike the new jets, it could loiter, it could take a beating, and it could deliver ordnance in terrain that made artillery unreliable or unavailable. It quite literally became the flying artillery of the Marine Corps. So when we talk about the Corsair and DCS, we're not just talking about a World War II dogfighter. We're really talking about the United States Navy's real first fighter bomber, a bridge between the prop-driven air superiority and jet-age close support. So let's shift gears, talk about what it's like to actually fly the Corsair in DCS. Now, as anyone who has tried knows, warbirds in DCS are notorious for being hard to fly. Frankly, punishingly so. And there's a reason for that. These airplanes are built around massive engines that generate a huge amount of torque, especially with radial engines. Now, the propeller isn't just pulling you forward, it's trying to twist the entire airplane in the opposite direction. And this is totally different than the average jet, especially 4th and 5th generation jets, because flying a modern jet is all about managing energy and thrust. Pretty much everything moves in a straight line from forward to aft or aft to forward. Well, until it doesn't anymore. But mostly flying a high-performance jet is about taming all of that thrust, while also staying out of the regions of flight where things start to rotate, if you know what I mean. In a warbird, flying is mostly about managing lateral forces and getting them all coordinated so the aircraft actually wants to fly in the direction it's pointed in. With a massive engine and a massive prop, this means you have to constantly manage torque which changes with power and also with angle of attack. And Since managing that torque is very much a job for your rudder, it means you need to fly with your feet constantly. Now, if you're not managing the rudder in a warbird, you're probably not flying it, which means you aren't flying precisely or accurately or getting the most out of the aircraft. Critically, at low speeds, like landing and takeoff, you aren't really flying at all, you're just slewing your way to the crash site. But here is the conundrum that every player, and frankly every developer, has ever had to deal with. Rudder work is hard to simulate. First of all, a lot of players don't have rudder pedals. And even if they do, it's hard to get the feel right without the physical feedback you'd get in a real cockpit. Unlike vertical accelerations, sensing lateral accelerations and uncoordinated flight is not a job for your eyes. It's a job for your ears and frankly for your behind, which are not senses that the average flight simulator can easily activate, although the advent of VR probably has helped. The bottom line is that a lot of warbirds, while physically accurate, become functionally extremely hard to fly, or at least enjoy flying, for someone who doesn't want to make it their life's work learning how to interpret all of those cues that are not natural. This, in effect, by the way, is not improved by the portion of the community, including some developers, who look down their collective noses at players who actually want to enjoy the product without having to prove their manhood every time they get in the cockpit. And that is what makes the Corsair so refreshing, at least for me. Yes, you absolutely have to fly this thing with your feet. But you know what? You actually can. It takes practice, but it's not so hard to learn that you're constantly prevented from making progress, which is unfortunately not uncommon in other warbirds. You know you're doing it wrong, you just can't figure out how to do it right because nothing works. So, if you're like me, you're also going to spend a lot of time trimming this aircraft. And I mean a lot of time. If you don't trim all three axes, yes, pitch, yaw, and roll, you will constantly be chasing the airplane around the sky, and you will be adjusting that trim constantly. But once you get it dialed in, the Corsair settles down beautifully, and your performance increases markedly. For me, the first requirement for enjoying the Corsair is to keep my eye on the ball, as the saying goes. That turn and slip indicator is what you have to be focused on. Now, thankfully, it's not hard, since it's right there at the base of the windscreen. But the other thing that the Corsair teaches you is the standard lesson of flying a warbird. You don't have a HUD. You have to spend time with your head in the cockpit, and you have to be able to scan your dials quickly to know what's right and what's wrong. Now, thankfully, the dials are laid out very well in the Corsair, and also the vertical positions of the needles, which is important, are in about the right place. So it's actually quite easy to develop a good, effective scan pattern. But if you try to fly this thing with your head out of the cockpit, it's going to punish you eventually. Now, takeoffs and landings, which are usually the boss fights of warbird sims, are challenging in the Corsair, but I think they're fair. Using myself as an example, I have managed to figure out how to get off the ground and back on the ground consistently, reasonably. I wouldn't say I do it well, but at least I do it successfully most of the time. Now, the same cannot be said for getting off and back on the boat. I have managed a single takeoff from a carrier in, multiple attempts, but I think I've cracked the code, and I think it'll get better. I haven't yet attempted landing, although others say that it's not as bad as you would think. Now, in the air, the Corsair feels heavy, which is good, because it is. But it also feels alive. It responds to inputs without feeling twitchy. It has presence, but it also has inertia. It reminds you that flying isn't always about managing speed and energy. It's about flying the airplane in all 6 axes. Best of all, it feels completely different than any of the jets I usually fly or have ever flown. And that's what I wanted when I picked up the module. I wanted a change of pace, but not a change of identity. It's immersive because of the fantastic detailing in the cockpit, but also because of the sound modeling, which features lots of thumps and chunks like you'd expect in a warbird. It definitely feels like being in a very different cockpit than flying a jet. So basically, for me at least, flying the Corsair in DCS helps me understand what it meant to be a pilot in that era, And since that's why I signed up for DCS in the first place, it basically checks all the boxes for me. Now, I should also point out that this update is not just about the airplane. With the Corsair release, we also get an Essex-class World War II aircraft carrier and the World War II version of the Marianas map. Now, we're not quite at full Pacific theater operations yet, because there aren't any Japanese aircraft, there's no Zero to Fight, no ground units or naval opposition to really flesh it out. But we do have the tools to start building, and we can already simulate World War II style ground attack. We have islands, we have targets, and we're working with a period correct carrier, and it's going to take some practice to learn how to do that. But most importantly, we have the right aircraft to fly from it. But perhaps even more interesting, I think, is that it actually gets kind of interesting when we look forward to Korea instead of the Pacific theater in World War II. Now, provided you don't mind accessing some truly outstanding community downloadable content, Korea becomes very accessible with the Corsair. Because remember, the Corsair flew in Korea. In fact, it was the primary Navy ground attack aircraft, and it was really the only aircraft that the Marine Corps flew. It flew from ground bases, but it also flew off of Essex-class carriers, even some of the older pattern Essex-class carriers. In fact, it flew off even smaller escort carriers. But it also flew off newer, upgraded Essex-class carriers, similar to the one represented by the downloadable and very excellent Bonhomme Richard. It also flew alongside F9F Panthers and Sky Raiders, both of which are available in DCS as downloadable community mods. And as far as terrain, if you add in the right terrain, and there are some maps that can substitute for Korea, I think even the Caucasus work pretty well in places, then you start to get something that's really compelling. Now, if you want to go full bore, you can even layer in F-86s and MiG-15s to simulate the multi-layered airspace of that war. Propeller-driven close air support below, jet combat above. That's not an anachronism, that's history. And what this means is that the Corsair isn't just a one-off warbird in a limited environment, even today. It's a gateway to a playable Korean War scenario. And that's a setting that has not gotten a lot of attention, and I hope it's going to get a lot more. So I guess I just want to end by saying, on this channel, I talk a lot about the evolution of air power. And truthfully, that's my main interest in DCS. I like DCS as a sandbox to experiment and experience the history of modern air power. Because that history isn't really about the planes. The planes are just the most obvious artifact of the technical and political and doctrinal processes that are going on in the background. Now, occupying as it does an important role in that evolution, starting out as a high-altitude, high-performance interceptor and ending up as a close air support workhorse, well, and one of the last of its kind, the Corsair is a snapshot of that moment in time when the performance of large piston-engine aircraft peaked, and then they were replaced by jets. Yet they were retained because there were still jobs they could do better than at least the early jets. So this aircraft flew in two wars, under two doctrines, for two branches of the U.S. military. It started out as a pure fighter and ended up as a flying artillery piece. And that arc, that transformation, is exactly the kind of story I'm here to tell. So, final verdict. For me, the DCS Corsair is beautiful. By the way, did I mention it's beautiful? The DCS Corsair is beautiful, complex, and rewarding. It respects history, it respects the player, it opens doors to both World War II and the Korean War scenarios that we haven't had before. It's not a toy, and it's not a casual ride, but it's not a punishing grind either. And as much as any other warbird I float in DCS, that makes me feel like I'm getting something back from the airplane as I learn to fly it. If you've never flown a warbird before, and you're pretty comfortable in a sim cockpit, this might be the one to start with. If you have flown warbirds before, you're going to find that this one has a character all of its own. Now, if you're a fan of history, not just aircraft, but doctrines and decisions that shape them, then the Corsair is more than just a plane. It's a turning point with wings. So, that's going to be all for now. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more missions or more commentary about the Corsair. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.